More than 60 years ago, our fathers and mothers brought forth on this island a chapel called Seaman's Bethel, conceived by those who believed sailors seeking a church home should have one. Since hundreds of ships from New England sailed here, once it was clear that sperm whales abound and could be found throughout the Pacific. And after months on the boundless sea, sailors were always happy to be in the loveliest fleet of islands called Hawaii. But once ashore, safe from the ocean's roar, their lack of faith came from historical lore. There is no God west of Cape Horn. The whalers' morals became worn down, so the good ship Mentor was called from Connecticut. Southward bound, they encountered terrifying, tempestuous storms as they sailed round that southernmost tip of Chile. And in May of 1833, after more than 5 months at sea, the intrepid Sixth Company were more than grateful to be in view of rows of coconut trees, flying their Bethel banner of olive branch and dove. They arrived to share the story of Jesus and his love. The American Seamen's Friend Society called young Reverend John Deal with his new wife Caroline and asked him to build a place, a sacred space dedicated to saving sailors. By 1837, this challenge was won. Yet in 1841, tuberculosis took its toll, and the kind-hearted pastor died en route to America. He was buried at sea, slid beneath the waves, separating him from his home country. Seaman's Bethel Chapel and Oahu Bethel Church were the first 2 seeds planted to satisfy the spiritual needs of Honolulu's growing community. Once again, the Seaman's Friend Society sent another in service of sailors. Samuel Damon arrived in 1842 when San Francisco was under Mexican rule and received news from the only English newspaper in all of Polynesia, from the west coast of North America to South America's Cape Horn. The Friend was a godsend to all, published by Damon and his church. At this time, from any hill looking toward Waikiki, one could see a forest of masts. Imagine Honolulu's past when in 1 year, 58 whaling ships and barks, 27 brigs and 35 schooners brought 15,000 sailors swaggering into town. On one morning alone, 30 vessels rounded legendary Diamond Head. Imagine all those sails spread like white wings riding currents of wind, like great seabirds soaring near the surface of the sea. By 1850, Seaman's Bethel became Bethel Union, and in 1856, the first foreign church became Fort Street Church, built for $15,000, plus the sale of 2 cows, which bought the steeple, and the people heard many who took their turn in that pulpit. The Reverends Taylor, Strong, Corwin, and Gulick preceded Freer, Cruzan, and Beckwith. In 1886, the Chinatown fire destroyed Bethel Union soon after Reverend Ogle had replaced Reverend Damon. The time for union had come. In November of 1887, in classic Congregational Democratic style, let us note, by majority vote, Fort Street Church and Bethel Union combined to become Central Union Church, but almost became, since another name had been considered, the Church of the Redeemer. With 337 members, Reverend Dr. Edward Griffin Beckwith was the first pastor. In his opening sermon, he declared, "How good and pleasant a thing it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." Although at this time in our history there was not yet unity in our diversity, although not alienated, we were separated from our brethren. We planted and nurtured many seeds that became trees in our community. The Fort Street Chinese Church, the Portuguese Evangelical Church, And for the Japanese, we helped build both Makiki Christian Church, designed like a Japanese feudal castle, and Nu'uanu Congregational Church. A few transient sailors still came to our shores, though not nearly as many as before. So another seed of support was sown, and from sapling to tree the Salvation Army has grown. Central Union's first sacred space, across from the Queen's Washington Place, was built of blue native basalt. Beckwith preached his first service in the new stone church. In December of 1892, and with this new church, the Queen was much pleased, though a year later she was not so much pleased when descendants of missionaries who sat in that same church during that same first service overthrew her monarchy in a bloodless revolution. It was not until years later our church apologized for this dissolution, but could not ever ask for absolution. In 1895, Reverend Burney was in the pulpit. He saw it fit that another seed be sown called Palama Chapel. And after the Great Fire, it was shown that Palama settlement was needed, and a few years later, Reverend Kincaid seeded Kalihi Settlement. Yet another testament to how our church has always spent time and effort on social services, outreach, to engage and embrace each to each. Our first missionary went to Nauru, the once phosphate-rich Pacific island, now sadly depleted. Before he left in 1915, Reverend Delaporte's Bible and hymnal translation were completed. Hawaii went from monarchy to republic to U.S. territory, and Reverend Scudder quickly followed Reverend Sylvester, who sent the Wicks couple as missionaries to China. Now to center stage in 1917 comes Reverend Albert Palmer. Committed to a belief with Jesus as his source, he declares the church was the great force which ought to be aroused to social reform and betterment. He supported plantation workers during their strike of 1920, who were merely asking for their fair share from those who had plenty. These men sat in Central Union's pews. The strike ended without workers receiving their dues except for his integrity. Palmer had everything to lose. It was a risk he was willing to take, and he offered to resign, but Waterhouse did not accept it. He said he was there to align their paths with Christ. The workers later quietly won a 50% raise. Much good had come from all their strife, and Palmer kept up the good fight throughout his life. The Richard Street Church became overcrowded, so a search for a new church site began. In 1920, architect Cram began to draw plans. 750 on the floor and 250 in the balcony, with chairs in wide aisles to accommodate more. The native blue basalt was quarried. In 1922, the cornerstone was laid, and in May of 1924, our sanctuary was completely made. Palmer was given a challenge from the architect. 18 letters and spaces he had to select. The Spirit led him surely, the result so perfect. He considered all that needed to be said in that space, a call to action for youth, an assurance of God's grace, meaning for the struggles of our middle years, for elders, wisdom and comfort when loss brings tears. The bride would be hopeful as she came down the aisle. The groom would see this hope reflected in her smile. And each Sunday, it would affirm what Jesus made clear through trials and celebrations. God is ever present, ever near. Reverend Palmer was followed by Reverend Swartz. Then Reverend Levitt took his turn in the pulpit. He encouraged the church to support Army and Navy evacuees who during Pearl Harbor were brought to their knees because of martial law and blacking out of lights. He orchestrated organ concerts on full moon nights. The front lawn had victory gardens to aid the war plight. Next was Reverend Hackett, who oversaw the Atherton Chapel build. In 1952, the pulpit was filled with Reverend Tom Crosby, who many baby boomers recall. He baptized and confirmed us and watched many a mall in his time. The women's, youth, and admin buildings were all planned, and Hawaii School for Girls was launched on our land. The narthex and chancel were redone, and a retirement home called Arcadia was begun. For 4 short years, Reverend Kenneth Ruick was ours, and choir director Roy Hallman brought a crowd of boys' angelic voices. Reverend Robert Midgley instituted the learning tree that gave us after-worship choices. He added the 7 o'clock service and encouraged the Korean church, and now Central Union had yet another search, so the Reverend Dale Turner was called as interim. He challenged us to recite Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters and many verses if you were to count. Ted Robinson then restored, renovated, and repaired, and a new parish hall was prepared. An extended search for the next leader of our church brought someone who knows the church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, the church is not a resting place, the church is the people. People in unity, anywhere and everywhere. People who are a community of remarkable diversity, no majority, no minority. People who have a capacity to understand the historic reality of what our church's mission has been and needs to continue to be. We are a church where seeds are sown and our past has clearly shown. When we seek to embody Christ and help those in need, when we engage and embrace all and make that our creed, we are doing what those 18 letters and spaces call us to be, the hands of one who taught us to serve humanity.